Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet.
For the past 20 years, American astronauts and Russian cosmonauts have lived and worked together aboard the International Space Station, ISS. This joint venture was made possible by a major breakthrough that occurred 40 years earlier when two adversaries, the United States and Soviet Union, joined hands in exploration.
In many other domains, they were ideologically at war around the world. But in space, the great other beyond Earth, they found common ground. They worked together to make a truly amazing joint mission, the Apollo-Soyuz test project, happen.
Although both nations were engaged in an ideological battle known as the Cold War, they completed a 9-day joint mission, making history as the world's first international human spaceflight. When East meets West, the exploration encounters an exchange of the Apollo-Soyuz test project, ASTP. In the 1950s and 60s, the United States and Soviet Union battled to be the first to explore space and land on the moon. Although the Soviet Union led the race, orbiting the first satellite and launching the first human into space, the United States was the first and only nation to leave footprints on the lunar surface. Despite the competition, President John F. Kennedy suggested joint space missions among the two nations before his death in 1963.
In the field of space, there is room for new cooperation, for further joint efforts in the regulation and exploration of space.
The entire world watched as three men explored the unknown.
Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
Armstrong is on the moon. Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American, standing on the surface of the moon.
As Apollo 11 explorers, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins rocketed out of the lunar orbit to return to Earth, President Richard Nixon boarded Air Force One, headed for the Johnson Atoll to greet them. During the flight, President Nixon and his advisors met with NASA's director, Thomas Paine, to discuss the future of manned spaceflight. Since space exploration is so expensive, international cooperation promoting technological exchange and scientific know-how was essential. Space exploration had to change from costly and duplicative competition to cooperation among nations. President Nixon and his advisors agreed. In 1971, NASA's director proposed a mission to test rescue docking hardware required for two vastly different spacecrafts to link up in space. The Soviets agreed. The Apollo-Soyuz test project was born. A breakthrough in advancing Apollo-Soyuz forward was the 1969 release of Hollywood film titled Marooned, starring Gregory Peck, based on the 1964 book by Martin Caidin. In the film Marooned, a Soviet Soyuz spacecraft and its cosmonauts are the heroes when they rescue a stranded American crew after its engine fails on its return to Earth.
Iron Man, a Russian spacecraft is making rendezvous with you.
This film laid a foundation for American and Soviet engineers to plan a mission that actually tested a docking mechanism that had been discussed since the early 1960s.
Encountering challenges and overcoming obstacles. The Apollo crew consisted of Thomas Stafford, Vance Brand, and Deke Slayton. Stafford was the commander of the American Apollo spacecraft. Alexei Leonov and Valery Kubasov flew for the Soviets. Leonov was the Soyuz commander, but before Apollo-Soyuz could ever fly, cultural, scientific, environmental, and political encounters had to be overcome. Culturally, the language barrier was the major obstacle.
We had a lot of fun because everybody made mistakes in the other language, and in some cases it's like learning listening to a 3-year-old trying to get better in English. So we made mistakes, and everybody got a lot of laughs out of that.
Scientifically, both sides had severe criticisms of the other side's engineering. Soviet spacecraft were designed with automation. Soviet spacecraft had been designed to minimize risk due to human error by having fewer manual controls. By contrast, Apollo spacecraft were designed to be operated by humans and required highly trained astronauts. The Soviet Union accused the Apollo spacecraft of being complex and dangerous. Robert Crippen, ASTP backup crew, pilot of the first space shuttle and commander of the 3 space shuttle missions, who later served as the director of the Kennedy Space Center from 1992 to 1995, critiqued the design of the Soyuz. We in NASA rely on redundant components. Each Soyuz component is designed for a specific function. If one fails, the cosmonauts land as soon as possible. However, American and Soviet engineers settled their differences in meetings in Houston and Moscow. They ended up combining features from both countries' designs.
The Soviets had their own way of doing things, and they didn't believe in redundancy that much, but they believed in their technology, and that has worked pretty well for them.
They did have a tremendous amount of knowledge about spacecraft. It was fascinating to me even at the time. Here we had an amazing human spacecraft program in the U.S. that we developed. The Soviets had one they developed completely independently, and they both really worked. So how do you put the two together in a way to work on a joint mission? We have different ways to deal with redundancy, different ways to deal with risks, metric, English, you name it. How do you put those together? But we did, and we did ultimately because of great leadership on both sides, and because the engineers, day in and day out, really came to trust each other and actually like each other, have respect for each other. But their passion was the exploration of space. Our passion was the exploration of space.
The critical component, the Androgynous Peripheral Docking System, APDS, when built, would allow either spacecraft to be passive or active during docking.
Environmentally, a major issue was that the atmospheric pressure and the gas composition inside the Apollo command module differed from that inside the Russian spacecraft.
For this mission, they've agreed to depressurize their vehicle down to 10 pounds pressure in order to prevent us from having to spend large periods of time going through pre-breathing when we transfer from one vehicle to another.
The astronauts could then safely open the hatch between the docking module and the Soyuz. Politically, with the close of the Vietnam War, relations between the United States and the USSR improved.
The political and animosity and all of the war kind of things that were going on the outside, and I would kind of include the Cold War in that, passed us by. We didn't pay any attention to it. None of us were really affected by it.
According to the Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev, Earth is big enough for us to live peacefully on it, but it is too small to be threatened by nuclear war.
We were in a position to open a crack in the door between East and West during the Cold War.
Apollo Houston, I got 2 messages for you. Moscow is go for docking. Houston is go for docking. It's up to you guys. Have fun.
It's about time we realize it. We're all in this together.
On July 17, 1975, American Apollo and Soviet Soyuz joined together 140 miles above the Atlantic Ocean. During their 2-day flight, astronauts and cosmonauts transferred between spacecraft. They conducted space experiments and tested the compatible rendezvous and docking system. Apollo Soyuz opened the door to international manned spaceflight.
You could easily look back and say that the change in the relationship with the Russians really happened because of Apollo Soyuz test project. And I think it will continue to stand, ASTP, Apollo Soyuz, will continue to stand as a foundation and a pivotal change in the future and the conduct of space operations in manned flight.
As explorers move on from the International Space Station outward towards the moon and visit the asteroids, they'll develop the skills and technology that will enable a human journey to Mars. While the Apollo-Soyuz test project is remembered for space exploration and scientific exchange, ASTP's Handshake in Space marked a turning point in history. The success of ASTP was not having 3 U.S. astronauts shake hands with 2 Soviet cosmonauts in space. The success was a cooperation between 2 adversaries, laying the foundation for the Mir shuttle program and the International Space Station. Historically, Apollo-Soyuz is still relevant today. American astronaut Scott Kelly and Russian cosmonaut Mikhail Kornienko just returned to Earth from their first ever 1-year mission aboard the ISS, providing a vital exchange of medical, psychological, and biomedical research on encounters faced by astronauts and cosmonauts during long-duration spaceflight.
None of this would have been possible without Apollo-Soyuz 40 years ago, that not only brought our nations together, but paved the way for the International Space Station and the missions yet to unfold that will take us to the stars.